So this lecture is to introduce some of you to a little more about the historical craft. I recognize in this class most of you in here are not history majors. This class will not turn you into a historian necessarily, but I wanted to share with you some fundamental insights about history that will kind of help shape and understand what we're going to do in this class. So what is the study of history? Broadly speaking, it's often defined as the study of change over time. How did things get from where we were to where we are? What changed and what explains that change? Historians tend to be particularly interested in studying topics like race, class, and gender, and how these categories have changed over time and shaped what people have done. And history really tries to cover all of society. Certainly there's a lot of history of very elite people, the history of great men and women who've been leaders and major movers and shakers, but a lot of historians are also very interested in the experience of common people, the average person. What was life like in an 18th century French village or a 12th century Chinese city versus a 19th century American city, right? All of these are different experiences, and a lot of people are seeking to understand that. Historians use a whole range of methods. I won't cover all of these. For more than anything else, historians do use textual analysis, and that's why in this class I will ask you to read various documents, particularly from the time that they were written, to engage with what happened in the past. That's one of the best ways historians know about what happened back in time. For more modern history, sometimes students use oral history. The study of material culture is really important to particularly the study of engineering. We can actually learn a lot about how things were engineered by looking at those structures that still exist and what's there, and we can learn things about what those people who built them knew. There's also a lot of approaches to the study of history. Just like engineering has all kinds of different branches, civil, mechanical, electrical, computer engineering, information technology engineering, petroleum engineering, right? In each of these fields, for those of you who are in engineering fields, you know that there's very different training about things that you need to know. Within history, and again, you will not be tested on this, you don't have to know all of this, I just want to give you a quick glimmer that there are lots of different kinds of historians. Social historians pay a lot of attention to social structures, to job occupations, things like demography. Cultural historians are often more interested in social values at different times. They'll often use more literary texts, performances to look at things. Economic historians, as you can imagine, are interested in the economics, and political historians, the politics. There's lots more of these, but I wanted you broadly to realize that history is an incredibly broad tent, just like engineering is, with lots of different approaches within it. One of the most important things to historians is distinguishing between primary and secondary sources. Primary sources are things that were written at the time of a historical event. And secondary sources are what history professors like myself write to help understand what happened in the past. So in the first module, you will be reading something about From Know-How to Nowhere by a scholar in the late 20th century who wrote about what happened to help understand it. We're also going to look at a couple documents that were written at the time. Those are the primary sources. For historians, primary sources are incredibly valuable, and I'll ask you to engage with those a little bit at the time. Historians are really interested in a concept they call contingency. And this is essentially the idea that things did not have to turn out the way they did. This sometimes sounds a little counterintuitive, right? We know how history unfolded at some level, right? We know today that where we are and that it must have come from the past. But historians are really interested in the fact that historical actors had choices, that they could decide what to do things. So engineers in the past had choices about what technologies to build, how to build them, the circumstances under which they would be built, and those had consequences, and those actors had some choices, just like the people around them had some choices. And so particularly contingency is important because it reveals agency. So historians are really interested in agency which is not like an institutional body here, like the Social Security Agency or administration. Instead, agency is the power to make purposeful decisions. And historians are really committed that actors in the past have different levels of power and agency, right? The President of the United States has different agency than a college student making minimum wage. And yet, any person, even within the history of slavery, even enslaved people with extremely little freedom, living under very hard choices, have certain levels of power to shape their existence. And for historians, tracking that really matters. Historians are also really interested in winners and losers. This is a pretty famous painting among historians about the idea of American progress, right? And what you see is American liberty floating across the stage, and you see different technologies, right? The stagecoach to the railroad to the transmission wire, and the plow coming through. And what you see basically is a view common among many, many, many white Americans of the 19th century, that white people were more civilized than Native Americans, who you can see on the left side being pushed out of the picture. That progress was these new technologies connected to a more civilized race that was going to take over the country. And obviously, there's much that we might, in today's world, disagree with about the sort of justness of this, and obviously this helps make stark that technological change came with winners and losers. And it didn't have to this way, right? There was contingency. These technologies could have existed without 19th century white Americans massacring so many Native Americans. That was not inevitable, which historians show, but it's part of the historical record, and tracing that matters. Wrong way. Historians also really believe history is alive and open to continual re-understanding. Of course, what happened in the past has happened and will not change, but history is the study of how we understand the past and what it ends up meaning to us. And it does change in a few different ways. It changes, of course, as political values change and what history is considered relevant to the present changes. And it changes as new methods are discovered. For example, we can reconstruct old documents in which the ink had faded too much for the human eye to read, but modern technologies can actually reveal what was written in it. And so we can actually find new sources about the past that tell us something more about what happened in the past that we never could have known. And that leads to new interpretations. Some of the interpretations are about our present moment and what it means. So right now, a pretty strong debate that's been happening in the historical field is between two interpretations of the nation's roots. And so the 1619 Project has very much highlighted that in 1619, the first Africans arrived in the New World and were enslaved. And that act of enslaving African Americans has been called by a number of people involved with the 1619 Project this sort of a foundation of America that has led to a pattern of racial injustice that is foundational to the nation and needs to be understood as an origin story of the nation. There has been pushback on this, and one form of this is the 1776 Project, which wants to argue that actually the nation's roots are in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, and a declaration that America will be a new place of freedom, of opportunity, and that even if it is acknowledged that America has not always lived up to its highest aspirations, it is still a model for the rest of the world to follow, and it has allowed more freedom and opportunity than other places. These are debated. We're not going to debate them here, but it's to capture the fact that history as an enterprise is an ongoing, dynamic, changing enterprise. It's not as if just because something happened once, we can know what it is once and move on. Instead, we need to continue to engage with what new we learn about the past and what it means in the present. The but not all, though, is really important here because historians do foundationally agree that all historical claims need to be based in evidence. We can disagree about which point of evidence is more important than another, but historians are insistent that their claims be based in evidence. And so it does mean that even if there are multiple interpretations that are possible, not everything is possible. You have to have a set of realistic evidence, or it can't be part of a meaningful historical debate. The history of engineering is a subfield of history. I would argue that it emerged around the 1970s, related to also the development of the history of technology as a subfield. And some of the questions that drive history of engineering are things like, how has the practice of engineering changed over time? Who counts as an engineer? Who does not? How does this change over time? This is certainly things we'll be looking at in this class. The history of engineering is also quite interested in what's the social status and role of engineers, and how has this changed over time? How are engineers similar or different to other professionals? And what are the social consequences of the technologies engineers develop and manage? We live in a society, in a world in which technology is so foundational to how we live. Engineers are directly connected to those, so we wouldn't want to study engineering without a sense of those technologies as well. And so fields like history of technology, history of science, and science and technology studies are linked to this. This then leads into a slide you're going to see throughout the rest of the class, which, building on the history of engineering and the historical craft, there are 5 themes we're going to look at throughout this class. The idea that engineering reflects and reshapes social context, that changes in engineering benefit some more than others. That's our winners and losers ideas. That the relationships between engineers, corporations, and governments have changed over time. That the social prestige varies across time and space. And that changes in engineering can have unanticipated consequences. So these are all ideas linked to what the history of engineering is. And again, I don't expect, for many of you, this will be one of 1 or 2 history classes that you'll take, and I just wanted to give you a little sense of the broader patterns of history in which this class fits and that we'll work into within each of the modules in this course.